Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to our webinar. My name is Heike Schön and I'm the Managing Director of the Loomis Group. And today we have our webinar about orphan designations. Have you got a global strategy? So we would like to cover with you a global aspect of your orphan designation. And just some upfront information for the organization, so you all will be on mute. We will have a poll at the beginning of each presentation where we ask you some questions and you have around 1 minute to answer the questions. And also we will first provide you with all the presentations, and that at the end we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer session. So please provide your questions into the chat so that we can all walk through and answer your questions. The speakers will turn the camera off after the introduction. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. So we have Liam Spencer, who is our Senior Regulatory Project Manager at the Loomis Life Science Company. He will talk about the European requirements for orphan designations. And as those of you who have participated in former webinars, we have always very special guests in our webinar, and this time we have the Global Pharma Solutions from Australia, represented by John Oakley, who will talk about the requirements for ODD in Australia and Asia Pacific, and Margaret Jenkins, who the Managing Director of Global Pharma Solutions, and she will introduce all the requirements for the USA orphan drug designations. And at the end, we will hear a lot about the Australian clinical trial landscape from the Associated Professor Tina Soulis from Alicia. Yeah, very warm welcome to the speakers. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, we have 3 different companies presenting here. So just to give you a little overview about what we are doing, the Loomis Life Science Consulting Company. Here we provide clinical, regulatory and quality solutions to pharma, biotech and medical device companies. We are working mainly with small to mid-sized companies, and especially with our regulatory department, we are focusing on European pre-approval developments like orphan drug designations. We do scientific advice, and we of course support your clinical trials or any pediatric planning you are envisioning. So I will hand over to Margaret to introduce Global Pharma Solutions.
Thanks very much, Heike. Global Pharma Solutions, or GPS, is a team of seasoned regulatory professionals. We're based both in Australia and the US. Each of us have at least 25 years experience in developing and registering medicines globally. As a group, we do support small to medium biotech companies as well as major multinationals to help them register new biologics, cell and gene therapies, blood products, small molecules and devices. Our goal is to pursue effective, expedited regulatory pathways to market approval on behalf of our clients. Thank you.
Yes, and Alicia, sorry, Tina, would you like to introduce your company?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Heike. Hello, everybody. Alithia Life Sciences is an Australian-based boutique, full-service capability clinical contract research organisation, a mouthful, really, to tell you that really we're full service capability. We mainly look after biotechnology and device companies who coming into Australia and the region to undertake from phase 1 to phase 3 studies in various therapeutic areas, not just rare disease, but a lot of first in human, oncology, neurology, and we are seasoned professionals with at least 20 years of operational experience. And I guess our mission is to support our clients to deliver efficient accomplishment of their projects and ultimately to better the health and well-being of human beings. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I will hand over to Liam, who will walk you through the webinar and who will also start with his presentation. So Liam, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Heike. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, where we'll be discussing orphan designations across different regions of the world. In addition to that, we'll also be talking about, as Heike said, the clinical trials and the benefits of running those rare disease clinical trials in Australia. So I'm going to start by talking about Europe. And I'm actually going to start my presentation with a poll question. So my poll question is, which countries or regions are you targeting with your rare condition? And I'm going to launch this poll and you should see it now. So if you could just answer these questions, give you 30 seconds or so, and we can all have a look and see what the trends are in this area. That's good. About a third of people have voted. Interesting. Just give it a few more seconds, almost halfway. Okay, I think we'll leave it as that. It's about half people. So that's got some good results. So you should be able to see the results now. And as you can see, the kind of unsurprising, I suppose, the two main areas would be the US and the EU. But there is some quite good interest in other areas of the world, which is good to see, because that is an important point of this webinar. So the first question with Europe is, I suppose, why should you apply for an orphan designation in Europe? And the benefits can be broadly categorized into two, I suppose. So you have those which are frequently discussed, which are those which are provided directly from the regulation, and those include particularly market exclusivity, so being free from competition from a similar medicine for 10 years from authorization. You also have quite significant reductions in regulatory fees, so this can potentially save you hundreds of thousands of euros, particularly with science advice. There's also the requirement to submit your application through the centralized procedure, which means there's just one application for the whole of Europe, which is quite good. Then you also have the scientific advice in the form of protocol assistance, which is normal scientific advice, it just has a slightly different name for orphan designation. Then the other category of benefits are more indirect and kind of less frequently recognized. So when a medicine is designated as an orphan medicine, it can look favorably upon lenders of money, and therefore can improve your eligibility for grants, but also can improve investor interest. And lastly, you have benefits at the member state level in the form of tax reliefs and reimbursement incentives. So collectively, these benefits are quite significant. It's estimated that about half of orphan medicines developed since the regulation was introduced would not be feasible without these benefits. So in other words, if you're developing a rare disease medicine, it's seriously worth considering. So if you're interested, then the next question is, what criteria dictates your eligibility? And I generally consider this in kind of 3 layers. So first of all, the condition must be seriously debilitating or chronically or life-threatening. And if it is, then you need to demonstrate it's a rare disease, which is normally through one of 2 avenues. Typically, it's through the prevalence and prevalence criteria that the condition does not exceed more than 5 in 10,000 in Europe. Or you could argue that investing in the condition is not financially feasible without the benefits. Regardless of the approach you take, you need to demonstrate either your medicine is addressing an unmet need, so there are no so-called satisfactory methods available for the condition, or that if there are satisfactory methods available, that your medicine is significantly better than the others. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So if you're interested in applying for an orphan designation, then the next step is to set up a project. And for me, one of the earliest steps is to kind of review the data you have in-house. What data do you have on the epidemiology of the condition? What data do you have on medical plausibility, on potentially any significant benefit? And based on your gaps, that should determine the level of literature search and potentially, therefore, the amount of work required. Then you can go onto the EMA website, and the EMA website publishes effectively kind of a monthly submission cutoff dates for orphan designation. And based on the workload you anticipate, you could target an appropriate date for that. But there's also something to consider, kind of a broader consideration with timelines, and that is are there any other regulatory procedures that you should consider before orphan designation? And I'm mainly thinking about SME status, because if you obtain SME status before orphan designation, it can make that process a little bit easier. And secondly, there is the question of whether you want a preparatory meeting. So this is a meeting you have with the EMA before your orphan designation, and is generally recommended for first-time applicants or complex products. But if you want one of those, you need to schedule them in or apply for at least a couple months before, so it impacts timelines. And then lastly, if you're not in Europe and you have no entity in the European Economic Area, you need to apply for an organisation which is like a consultancy. So that's another requirement. So what does the application actually look like? So at the heart of the application is the scientific document. That's what justifies your eligibility for this designation. But this slide also emphasizes there are other parts of the application you must consider. You need to compile your references, and if there are any non-English references, they need to be summarized in English. As I was mentioning, you need to demonstrate that either your entity, a subsidiary, or a consultancy you're applying through is in the European Economic Area, so you need proof of establishment. You also need translations of the active substance or the orphan condition, and this is made easier if you have SME status because the EU will help you with the translations. And lastly is IRIS. So IRIS is the portal you submit orphan designations through, and sometimes companies kind of forget and leave this to the last minute, because which is not preferable, because if you've never worked in IRIS or your company never has worked in IRIS, you have to set up accounts. You need to register your organization, you need to register your product, and all that can take time. So it's worth focusing on IRIS quite early on. In terms of the scientific document, there is 5 different sections to it. I won't have time to go through them all, but often the more challenging areas I find are section B, is it prevalence, or section D, which would be other methods. So prevalence always has to be demonstrated in an application, regardless if there are other orphan medicines already designated for that same condition. You always have to demonstrate prevalence. And this can prove challenging because you need to consider your data sources. You need to consider any extrapolations from maybe one member state to the whole of Europe. You also need to consider your assumptions. One major assumption is the duration of your condition, because that impacts prevalence and the prevalence statistics you use. And sometimes you need to have a biased statistician. And if so, that's a resource you need to plan. Then there's section D. So this is where you either make one of 2 arguments. So you either demonstrate that there are no so-called satisfactory methods for that condition. So a satisfactory method is often, say, an approved medicine used according to its intended use. So kind of any off-label uses, or even any non-medicine approaches like surgeries or diets, you could potentially argue as being not satisfactory. In terms of, or if there are satisfactory methods, or say, for example, an approved medicine used according to its intended use, then you need to demonstrate that your medicine is significantly better, which can be on the grounds of efficacy, adherence, or less frequently, safety. In any case, when looking at significant benefit, there must always be a comparative element. You must always be comparing your medicine to the other methods. For the submission, as I said, you make it through IRIS. It should be validated within about a month. You could have validation queries you need to address. Once it then goes for review, you then have typically two stages to it, if you like. So first of all, there's a meeting at day 60. And shortly afterwards, you probably will receive queries on your application, which normally you have to respond to in writing, but also in verbally through a video call. Your response can then be reviewed at a second meeting at day 90, and that's when the Committee of Orphan Medicines can prepare their opinion, and they will then issue that to the European Commission, who will make a legal decision within 30 days. As I said earlier on, in terms of preparatory meeting, that is something you need to apply for as a separate IRIS submission, but you need to do that a couple of months before your planned orphan designation submission, to give you time to have a meeting, give you time to make the edits. This is my final slide, and it's just to emphasize that there are other points to consider rather than just the initial application, because once you have orphan designation, you need to maintain it, so you need to submit annual reports. And when it comes to market authorization, you need to demonstrate again that your product is still eligible for orphan designation. And this can be quite, for this you kind of need to prepare for it. So sometimes protocol assistance can be worthwhile before market authorization, but also planning your development. If you're making an argument on significant benefit, then maybe you could factor in endpoints to compare your medicine to the appropriate methods. And then lastly, if you're applying for orphan designation, the chances are that there will be other suitable procedures that you could apply for. SME, about 50% of orphan designations are for SMEs. So that's definitely one that you could frequently look at. But also many medicines for rare diseases are innovative and particularly advanced therapies. So it's worth considering prime and 18V classification respectively in Europe. Okay, so that's everything from me. I'm now going to pass over to John at GPS, who's going to talk about the APAC region.
Thank you very much, Liam. Now, first we're going to start with another poll question. So what type of products are you developing for rare or orphan diseases? Small molecules, cell therapies, gene therapies, drug conjugates, or other? So if you could just select one of those, and Liam, if you could just let me know when voting's completed.
Just leave it maybe 10 more seconds or so. Just got over half of the votes, so I think I'll probably publish the results now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so quite a range there, quite a few others. So it'd be interesting to know what they were. But again, a mixture of small molecules, gene therapies in particular, and some conjugates. So yeah, quite a broad response there. Right, next slide, please, Liam. Right, I'm going to start off talking about Australia. Despite rare diseases being by definition rare, when you add all the many individual rare diseases together, there's quite a lot of people affected. In Australia, that's estimated to be around 2 million people from our current population of 27 million. In 2020, a National Strategic Action Plan for Rare Diseases was launched. So how does the strategy relate to medicines? Action 2.4.3 states, ensure people living with a rare disease have equitable access to medicines with demonstrated clinical benefits for rare diseases, including those that are already funded for another condition. Next slide, please. Right, the TGA first introduced an orphan drug program back in 1998 when we had a population of around 20 million. It was established with the assistance of the FDA and covered medicines, vaccines, and in vivo diagnostic agents. There was no requirement for the product to be an NCE. There was a formal exchange of letters between the FDA and the TGA. And this agreement allowed the FDA to share with the TGA the US orphan designation request and the FDA review, as well as evaluation reports for any subsequent NDAs for the orphan indication. I have actually made use of this arrangement for the registration of an orphan NCE in Australia, and despite being a little complex to get to work, we did actually save some evaluation time. The benefit of the orphan designation was the waiver of TGA evaluation fees and also the waiver of reimbursement fees. As the TGA operates on a cost recovery basis from pharma industry fees, the waiver of fees by the TGA for orphan drugs means these costs must be recouped from other TGA activities. Next slide, please. The program was reviewed in 2015, and what was the outcome? The rare disease threshold was raised from a prevalence of 2,000 people to less than 5 in 10,000 people. So that was opening up the prevalence to a much greater range of diseases. The condition being treated must be seriously debilitating or life-threatening. And orphan designation is no longer open-ended. Once you had it, it used to be you had it for the life of the drug, but for now it lapses after 6 months with 1 6-month extension possible. Therefore, timing of your orphan application in relation to your marketing application is really, really important. And you would normally submit your orphan application 2 to 3 months before your intended submission of your marketing application. The program does exclude biologicals, and the categories that the TGA classes biologics are listed there. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just quickly run through the current TGA orphan criteria. It must be a single indication. It must be a serious condition. The patient group must be medically plausible. It must meet the prevalence threshold of less than 5 per 10,000, or the sponsor must demonstrate the lack of financial viability. The product can't have been rejected elsewhere for safety reasons, elsewhere being the USA, Canada, the EU, or the UK. There shouldn't be any other goods approved for that indication, or if they are, your product provides a significant benefit compared to existing goods. And as Liam explained, that benefit can either be an increase in efficacy or an improvement in safety. Next slide, please. Right, so you think you want to apply for an orphan drug designation. Where do you start? Do you have access to an application submitted in another jurisdiction, or are you creating one from the beginning? If you've got one from another jurisdiction, you can certainly reuse parts of it, including details of the condition, medical plausibility, and possibly comparison against other registered goods. What you will need to do is establish the prevalence of the condition in Australia. While the TGA has adopted the EMA's points to consider on estimating prevalence for orphan designation, you will generally need Australian prevalence data. This can be from various sources, including local registries, published literature, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data sets, and possibly information from KOLs as well, or patient groups. If there's no Australian data, you may be able to justify extrapolating data from overseas. Next slide, please. So, is it worth it? Applying for an orphan drug designation is free, and although the fee waiver is the only benefit, this still makes the orphan application, the orphan designation worthwhile. I've just listed there the TGA submission and evaluation fees. For a new chemical entity, it's $217,000. An extension of indications, $129,000. And the reimbursement fees are also significant. They can be up to $250,000. So in some cases, when you're looking at both registration and reimbursement, you can save almost $500,000 in the evaluation fees. So certainly worthwhile. Next slide, please. There was a recent government inquiry into the approval processes for new drugs and novel medicines, and it made the following recommendations relevant to orphan drugs. The first one was to replace the existing orphan fee waiver with a HEC-style fee waiver. What this means is the sponsor would incur a debt when they receive orphan designation, but this would only need to be repaid once sales of the product reached a certain threshold. The other proposal was to extend data exclusivity for orphan drugs and vaccines for a period of up to 10 years. It should be noted that these are recommendations only at this stage and may not be adopted. Next slide, please. I'll now move on to the broader Asia-Pacific area. This region covers more than 40 nations and over 50% of the world's population. It's estimated the market for orphan drugs will be over $50 billion by 2027. So what are the challenges? The legal and regulatory frameworks for orphan drugs in this region is still developing and varies between countries. And there are differences in how rare disease is defined and also the criteria for orphan drug designation. In 2018, APAC launched an action plan on rare diseases to develop public engagement, establish patient registries, and improve patient access to clinical trials. Next slide, please. Right, this table gives an overview of orphan drug programs across 6 Asian countries. I've included China as well. Although it doesn't yet have a formal orphan program, it's working to improve access to drugs for rare diseases. You'll notice the prevalence criteria vary quite a lot between countries. All offer various incentives ranging from fee reductions, taxation benefits, market exclusivity, or clinical trial support. Next slide, please. Right. I'll now discuss a project GPS worked on to register a biologic in Taiwan and South Korea. The product was a third-line treatment for metastatic cancer. In the USA, it had received breakthrough designation, priority review, and accelerated approval. It wasn't an orphan drug in the US. In assessing a regulatory strategy, orphan designation or expedited pathways were considered. Next slide, please. In Korea, it was possible to obtain orphan designation using prevalence data from existing registries, as well as a recommendation from the Korean Orphan and the Central Drug Center. It also met the criteria for fast-track designation and received priority review. It also qualified for post-marketing exclusivity. Next slide, please. However, in Taiwan, orphan designation was not possible as the rare diseases list excludes cancers. However, it was still eligible for priority review due to disease prevalence, disease seriousness, and unmet medical need. There's also flexibility around the evaluation. The bridging study evaluation and CPP don't need to be submitted in advance, and if clinical trials have been conducted in Taiwan, the CPP can be waived. I might also say, if it had been a treatment for children, there's also a program that can provide a priority review voucher. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we've seen, Asia is rapidly emerging in terms of policy development and regulatory framework to improve access to orphan drugs. We've seen that the definition of a rare disease varies from country to country, as well as the criteria for orphan designation. There may well be other pathways or programs available other than orphan designation that can lead to earlier approval. And finally, the use of foreign clinical data may not be accepted in all markets. Some may require data from an Asian population. I'll now hand over to Margaret Jenkins, who will speak about the US.
Okay, thanks very much, John. So as with the other speakers, we'll start with a poll question. So if you could put the question up there, Liam, thank you. What are the biggest issues you are facing in your orphan development programs? So I'll give you a little while to insert your answers. Okay, if you could put the results up when you're ready, Liam.
Yeah, I'll just give it a few more seconds at 40%, and then see if there's anyone else. Okay, I think we'll just go with that. And share.
Okay, very interesting. So financial or investor support, as well as global strategic advice, seems to be the winners here, and also skill development support. Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's move on to the first slide, Liam. All right, thank you. So I'd like to start with the facts in the US. So there's over 7,000 individual rare diseases in the US, affecting 1 in 10 people, which amounts to over 30 million people affected. 50% of these patients are children, and 30% of whom will not reach their 5th birthday. So very sobering statistics there. And greater than 90% of those rare diseases lack FDA-approved treatment. And 85 to 90% of them are serious or life-threatening. So some very sobering statistics there. Next slide, please, Liam. Okay, so what is a rare disease? The definition of a rare disease in the US is a disease or condition that affects less than 200,000 people. And legislation was passed in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act, which incentivizes the development of drugs to treat rare diseases. One such incentive was the Orphan Drug Designation, or ODD. Next slide, please. So why submit an ODD in the US? So I mentioned incentives on the last slide. So what are they? One such incentive is market exclusivity. There's a potential for up to 7 years market exclusivity in the US, which is usually 5 years for an NCE. There's some quite substantial financial incentives as well, including 25% tax credits for qualified clinical trials, fee waivers for the PDUFA fees. PDUFA stands for Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and currently those fees sit at just over $4 million. So that's quite a significant saving. In addition, if you qualify as a small business in the US and you're submitting your first application, you also qualify for that fee waiver. There's also an Orphan Products Drug Program, grants program, which is, if you qualify, it includes clinical trials and also natural history studies. So other incentives include access to the OOPD, or the Office of Orphan Products Development staff, and potentially a waiver of your initial pediatric study plans, although there are exceptions to that. And one important thing is it can attract investor interest. So if you're a small biotech company relying on investor funds, these sorts of incentives could be quite interesting to you. Next slide, please, Liam. Okay, so what are the eligibility criteria? Prevalence has to be less than 200,000, as I mentioned, or if the prevalence is greater than 200,000 patients in the US, we need to demonstrate that the cost of developing and putting the product on the market will not be recouped. A third eligibility criteria can be, you can actually submit for an orphan subset of a larger indication that is not rare. So there may be a particular attribute of your product which acts only in the particular orphan subset. So you have to show that, and also show that the product is not effective in the broader indication. So what data do you need to submit? Non-clinical and or clinical, to demonstrate that there's a medical plausibility for expecting the drug to be effective in the condition. You also need to show, as you've seen for other regions of the world, that a drug has not yet been approved in the US for the same indication, or if a drug has been approved, that your product is clinically superior. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few questions and tips here that may be useful if you're intending to submit for an ODD. So do you have strong in vivo and or clinical data? If you're using in vivo data, is your model validated? How robust is your prevalence data? Do you involve KOLs? They can actually be very useful, as we've seen in other regions. It's really important to get your prevalence data well cited and well supported. And it has to be relevant, and it also has to be current at the point of submitting the ODD. So in terms of the timeline, you can submit an ODD before your NDA or BLA submission in the US, and the FDA will make a decision in 90 calendar days. This can be shortened to 60 days if it is submitted with what we call a rare pediatric disease designation, or an RPDD, which I will touch on later, or in fact if you also submit with a fast track application. So what does the submission involve? There's an online form. It's not easy to navigate, I have to say. You submit to the Office of Orphan Products Development through the NextGen CEDAR portal. There is a public domain database, which is quite easy to search and use. And it's also useful to note that once you gain an ODD, your product will also be on that database. So it's public domain information. Do you have an agent who's resident in the US? This is quite important because the FDA requires that you have someone who's resident in the US to submit the application and also be a contact for the agency. Next slide, please, Liam. Okay, so a very busy slide here, but it really just maps out the process and the approval. So along the top, we have the typical drug development milestones here: drug discovery, preclinical and clinical, FDA review, and then availability to patients. So I won't go through everything, but I might just point out a couple of key things here on this slide. So there is a guidance that's just been finalized in December 23. It was actually draft since 2019. So this is a guidance that I would recommend that you look at. It's for rare diseases, considerations for the development of drugs and biological products. A really good, useful reference point there. It's also important to note that as well as ODD, there are other expedited programs and designations that could be available to you if your data is strong enough, of course, and that needs to be shown. So, for example, breakthrough therapy, fast track, accelerated approval, priority review, or Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy Designation, or RMAT. And we're currently working on a program at the moment that has ODD. It also has Fast Track, Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy, and we are putting together a BLA for accelerated approval. So there's a lot of extra incentives and advantages there as well. So the orphan designation will be granted in 90 days. That's the target. As I mentioned, it can be shortened if with submission of other applications at the same time, including RPDD. The annual report is also required, as it is in Europe, but the submission can actually be made simultaneously with the European annual report. And orphan drugs also are subject to the full FDA review period as well. Next slide, please, Lynn. Okay, so I mentioned rare pediatric disease designation. If you remember on the first slide, I mentioned that 50% of patients who have rare diseases are children. So there's additional incentives from in the US for developing drugs for rare pediatric diseases. So this designation is for a serious life-threatening disease. You also need to show that the serious or life-threatening manifestations occur primarily from 0 to 18 years. And also the disease must be a rare disease or condition affecting less than 200,000 patients. So in the application, you need to show the supporting data, and in rare instances, you could actually submit in vitro data. That will have to be, the exception rather than the rule. So preferably in vivo, or of course clinical is the most preferable, and a description of the mechanism of action as well. The active ingredient, as before with ODD, needs to be not previously approved. Proof of prevalence is also important, and also proving that the manifestations primarily affect children from 0 to 18 years. So along with your prevalence, also the mortality rate is important there. So the submission, as I mentioned, it can be submitted with a request for ODD and or fast track. There should be a 60-day review period for both, that's calendar days. However, we actually have recent experience where the agency did not approve the ODD in 60 days along with the RPDD, which was disappointing. They took the full 90 days. There is no public domain database for RPDDs. And once again, you need an agent who's resident in the US. And also, of course, this can attract investor interest. Next slide, please, Liam. So this is the final slide and potentially the cherry on the top for developing rare diseases. You may have heard of the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'll just refer to it as the voucher. And so with the voucher, if you're intending to apply for a voucher, the RPDD is not essential, but it is recommended by the agency. You can request the voucher with submission of your NDA or BLA, and the voucher will be awarded on approval of that submission. Only one voucher is allowed for the same drug. The treatment or the clinical data that you submit must be clinically meaningful for the particular patient population, which is the pediatric patient population. And there is also a sunset clause. So this year, the sunset clause is enacted in September 30th, 2024, which means that the agency will no longer award vouchers after September 30th this year. The exceptions are if you have a rare pediatric disease designation by September the 30th this year, or indeed if your product is approved by September the 30th, 2026. I have to say though, before any of you get too worried, those sunset clauses have been in place for around 10 years now since the vouchers have been available, and these clauses have been extended. So it's good to keep an eye on this. It's not clear when those clauses will actually be enacted, but at the moment the sunset clause is in place till September 30th. Once again, there's no public domain databases for these vouchers, and as you may know, they can be used to gain priority review for subsequent BLAs or NDAs, and those submissions need not to be for a rare disease, so a big advantage there. But the biggest advantage, I think, from clients that we've worked with is that these vouchers can be transferred or sold. And some of the eye-watering prices that we've seen are between 65 million and 350 million that in terms of the value of these vouchers. So a lot of advantages there. And with that, I will pause and hand over to Tina from Alethea. Thanks, Tina.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and welcome everybody. And I think we're also going to start off with a poll. And the question here is, have you experience of conducting clinical trials in Australia? So we'll give you half a minute or so to answer that. Okay, thank you everybody. Hopefully we've got some results now.
Yep, we've got about 50%.
Thanks.
We can probably have that now. Yep.
Fabulous. Oh, so the majority have not. So that's great, because we're going to spend the next 5 or so minutes talking about Australian clinical trials. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Liam. I just want to set the scene by talking about the status of clinical trials around the world. We're going to the next slide, please. No, the one before that, Liam. Yes, fantastic. Thank you very much. So just to set the scene, we know according to clinicaltrials.gov, as of the end of April, we saw about nearly 500,000 clinical trials at various stages of recruitment at various phases registered. And we know that of those trials, 2.3% came from Australia. So just to set the scene, and it sort of fits in with our small population, which also makes up about 2% of the world's population. So next slide, please, Liam. Just like any other country around the world, the type of documents you would need to undertake your study in Australia include the protocol or investigational protocol, the, of course, investigator brochure, product information, the consent form. You need some local clinical trial insurance. And with regards to the investigational product, there are slight little nuances on the labeling of that product. You also need a local study sponsor to undertake your study in Australia, or you can designate that to a contract research organisation, or you can do it yourself if you set up a local subsidiary. If you do set up a local subsidiary, you will need an Australian resident director. Next slide, please, Liam. In terms of whether you have a local sponsor or a local director through your local subsidiary, as I said, you will need your local clinical trial insurance, and the local sponsors or directors' contact details on the investigational product. You'll need to be responsible for pharmacovigilance reporting, signing off the indemnity and clinical trial agreements. The local director's name will be on the Australian Securities Commission paperwork, and just like anywhere around the world, you will also need to be responsible for annual reporting to the ethics committees or IRBs. Next slide, please, Liam. One of the really great and favourable value propositions for Australia right now is a ruling that we had by the federal government since 2011, and it's very fair and generous tax incentive, which means that if you set up a local subsidiary in our country because you have an annual turnover of less than 20 million Australian dollars globally, you can set up a local subsidiary, and in exchange for this, you put in your annual tax return and you can claim 43.5% back of whatever you spend on R&D. And the eligible activities include preclinical work, manufacturing, clinical activities, regulatory, anything that involves R&D. So it's a really nice proposition. And if we go to the next slide, you will see that if we take into account the R&D tax incentive as well as the favourable exchange rate for most of the audience compared to the Australian dollar, and there have been studies that have been undertaken to demonstrate that the same study undertaken in the US versus Australia was actually 60% less expensive to undertake in Australia. So the next slide, please, Liam. One of the other advantages, not just cost effectiveness, but also the ease of approval associated with the timelines of approval. We generally quote that from the time that you have your submission package, such as your protocol investigator brochure, to first patient first visit, it's usually 3 to 4 months, which is very favourable. And during that time, that includes the preparation of the ethics submission, review by the ethics committee and approval, negotiation of contracts, and a collection of the essential documents. And once we have ethics approval, we submit a regulatory form online, and our regulators, they do not review. It's all done by the ethics committees. The regulators acknowledge the study and we can start recruiting. So it's very time and process efficient. So the next slide, please, Liam. In addition to the regulatory ease of approval, we also have National Mutual Acceptance Scheme, which means that one of the sites can take on a lead site and do all the paperwork and get the ethics approval, and the other sites will accept that approval, and they just have to undertake contracting or governance. As I said, in 99% of cases in Australia, there is no regulatory review. And in fact, you do not have to have an open IND to undertake a study in Australia. And that's true for any of the phases of phase 1, 2, or 3. Even for phase 1, we don't generally need GMP material. It can be GMP-like. So it's a very efficient process, not only for cost and time. Next slide, please, Liam. In terms of rare diseases, we should acknowledge that we do have a small population of just over 26 million. However, in addition to the time and cost efficiencies, there are also other advantages. For example, we don't need a requirement for qualified person IMPD, and many rare diseases in our country have very strong advocacy groups, and we work closely with these advocacy groups to actually bring trials into Australia. But most importantly, these advocacy groups work together with their patient populations and support recruitment of these studies efficiently and effectively. The approval process in the country is also the same, whether it's a rare disease or non-rare disease, and it's the same whether it's a phase 1, 2, or 3 study. The only exception here is if you are working in gene therapies or gene technologies, there is an additional parallel approval required from the Office of Gene Therapy and Research, and that's really a validation of the facilities to be used within the particular clinical trial. And the very last slide, thanks, Liam, is just directing the audience to a really lovely handbook released by the TGA called the Australian Clinical Trial Handbook, which really outlines the process that I have been talking about and is a great reference and a first port of call. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to hand you back to Liam.
So just before we go to a questions and answers section, I will just summarise what we've been through today in a conclusion. Just a heads up, if anyone is interested in asking any questions, there is a questions function in the control panel for the webinar. So just feel free to type any questions in you have. I think today we've seen the range of benefits available for orphan designations across the regions, and it can typically be strong financial incentives, but also scientific support as well. And there are some areas, some data that overlap between applications for regions, which means that you can leverage this data across the different applications. Of course, there are also some regional specific information, particularly things like prevalence and potentially any kind of argument of significant benefit, but there may still be room for leveraging these data as well. And there are differences that should be noted, particularly with the procedure of orphan designation applications across the regions, such as local agent requirements and any submission portals that you should factor into your planning. And when preparing your global strategy, as well as considering the range of orphan designation applications, it's important to think of the broader picture, and if there is any procedures such as or designations like SME or Prime or Fast Track, etc., that could be also applicable for your product. And we've also seen the advantages of running a rare disease clinical trial in Australia, the cost effectiveness, the low bureaucracy, and of course the advanced healthcare environment can be favourable when combined with the strong advocacy groups in rare diseases. So I hope that some of this information has given you some pointers, some inputs to your strategy for your rare disease development. I'm now going to move on to a questions and answer section, and we can have a bit more of a discussion on this topic. This slide is just a summary of the different orphan designation applications, which I won't go through here today, but these slides will be publicly available. Okay, so for questions and answers, as I said, there's a function in the portal if you want to ask any questions. We have actually had a question, which was an interesting one, and the question was, often epidemiology is not well defined. Can one extrapolate from data generated in other countries? So just from my input, at least for Europe, there is a separate guidance document for prevalence in Europe, which kind of, first of all, implies the importance of this topic, but also it does kind of partly address this question. So if you can only find epidemiological data in some countries, maybe some member states and not others, or maybe even some other national regions, it can be possible to extrapolate that data, but you have to consider the assumptions, particularly, for example, of there can be spatial differences in diseases across different regions. Some diseases exist more in Scandinavia than they do in South, so you can't just extrapolate all the way down. And also there can be demographic differences, or for example, age. Certain diseases exist only in certain ages, so if you're extrapolating it, you must consider the age bracket, for example. So extrapolation can be possible, but it has to be well thought out. I'm going to pass this question now on to Margaret, and I don't know if you have any thoughts from the USA perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Similarly, actually, yes, you can extrapolate data from other regions. However, the short answer is that you need to show how that data is generalizable to the US population and what the limitations of the data are. And as Liam said, there could be particular, subpopulations or areas where it's not generalizable. So, and gathering prevalence or epidemiological data is not an exact science, is it? It's difficult sometimes because we're working with orphan populations. So it's actually difficult to find the data because there's so few patients involved. But it's something that, in the US, look at the US Census Bureau, look at registries, literature, etc. And if you can't find that, then yes, go outside of the US. But as I say, it must be generalizable. So I hope that answers the question, but it's a really case-by-case basis.
Yeah, that's interesting. And John, do you have any inputs from your regions?
Liam, look, the TJ has adopted the same EMA document that you referenced before, so it is possible. But again, as Margaret said, you've got to make the case for it and show that the data you're extrapolating from that group is relevant to the Australian population, and demonstrate that there aren't any differences that might affect your assumptions. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we also have a second question here, which will be for Margaret for the US. So the question is, it's quite an interesting one. So, what about prevalence in the USA? Given that the population is increasing, will the definition be updated at some point?
That's possible, actually, that's possible. It's hard to look into the future, but currently it's less than 200,000. As populations change, yes, that's actually possible. Yeah, hard to answer any more definitively than that, to be honest.
Yeah.
At this stage.
We now have a question for the EU. So the question is, what is seen as similar? For example, if I have an MEK inhibitor with ODD, when time for market, if there is another MEK inhibitor with similar safety effect, will that always be blocked? So similar medicines this is for, regarding market exclusivity. So a similar medicine typically has to have a similar structural features. So that's one. It needs to have similar pharmacological effects, so generally the same pharmacological target and outcome, and also be used for the same therapeutic indication. If an applicant can argue that one of those three are not the same, then it could be argued that's not a similar medicine. So those are the three requirements really with regards to market exclusivity in similar medicines. Okay. Don't think we've got any other questions. I'll wait to see if any come through. I do have an interesting point from my perspective in terms of this topic of global orphan designations is what what would you consider is the best timing for the applications? And I think that's quite an interesting conversation with preparing a global strategy. So certainly from the EU perspective, it is beneficial to apply as early as possible, because then you can get as much discount as you can off science advice, etc. Margaret, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, I would concur with that in the US, Liam, as early as possible, and also talk to the agency as well. And I think, you know, if you're, I don't know if the previous question around the prevalence in the US was hinting at, you know, if you have an orphan designation or an orphan population that is at about the limit, you know, this is a good thing to tackle early. And as I say, talk to the agency. And also in the guidelines that the agency delivers, they do say, and as I said, it's not an exact science. So talk about it early. You know, if you find that you have a range of sources which say that the prevalence is potentially, I don't know, 190,000 or 210,000, then you're just on the borderline. So it's really important to drill down to that and take your time, do it early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And John, do you have any thoughts on timing of orphan designations across your region?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the orphan designation is only valid for 6 months. It can be extended for another 6 months potentially. So you really want to apply for designation just 2 to 3 months before your intended submission date.
Yeah,
and,
no, that makes
because one of the criteria is the comparison with registered therapeutic goods. So if you do delay your marketing application and your orphan application, there's always the chance another product will get in there and block you from getting orphan designation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I suppose as a more general question, what would you consider to be the biggest issues that the industry faces? I think from my input, from seeing the products and the answers we had earlier, because obviously gene therapy is quite important. We've seen you might see that in the news as well, gene therapy with rare diseases. So there's always that aspect of that ATMP confounding factor, if you like, which can add complexity to the process. I don't know, I mean, Tina, I don't know if you have any thoughts, particularly with like the clinical trial area of the general development of medicines for rare diseases.
Yes, thank you, Liam. I guess one of the largest challenges is that of recruitment because of the nature of the rarity of the diseases. And we've sometimes seen studies that only 200 patients, for example, but they've had to open in 50 countries because each site could only recruit one, n equals 1. So therefore, the cost and time implications are very heavy. So that is a consideration to get that right and look at all the, you know, as many regions as you can to obtain that data.
And Liam, I might just add another particular issue, you know, particularly with clinical trials, is the ethical issue of conducting randomized controlled trials. You know, we've had examples where we've spoken to the FDA and they have tried to insist that a randomized controlled trial is the most appropriate. And of course, that's the gold standard. Of course it is. But particularly for serious or life-threatening diseases, there is that ethical consideration of including patients, particularly children, actually, in controlled trials where there's potentially a 50% chance they may get the placebo. And if it's serious or life-threatening, you know, particularly with the children, as I say, parents are not willing to do that. You know, we had an example where the client had to actually start an expanded access program where the product was available to the children, and that was the enrollment for that expanded access program was far greater than for the randomized control trial, as you can see. So certainly a major consideration.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see, we've got a bit of time. We've got 2 more questions from the audience. So there was a question which was, in summary, would you say market exclusivity protection is stronger in the EU or US? I think it's probably quite a difficult question, but yeah, I'm not sure, Margaret, if you ever thought. I mean, in the EU, it's pretty strong. There's always a risk. There is a slight risk it could be reduced after 5 years if a member state feels the product's no longer an orphan designation. It could be reduced, then it could actually be reduced then down to 6 years. But I'm not really sure how. I don't think that's too common. But I don't know, Margaret, if you have any thoughts on the strength of market exclusivity in the USA.
Yeah, it's pretty strong, Liam. It's pretty strong, but again, it can be threatened if there is another product that comes along and is superior. So yeah, it's pretty strong, and it's a good incentive, but it's only one of the incentives as well. You know, there's plenty of others that are very strong in the US as well.
Yeah. And just the final question, just before we wrap up, this is probably a good question to finish on. It's quite an interesting one. Is, do you envisage a change to the orphan strategies with proposed new legislation for ODDs in Europe? This is an interesting, for anyone who doesn't know, the pharma legislation in Europe is under review. And yeah, I don't know if it will change. I think the orphan regulation, from what I've seen from the previous consultation, is it's been quite successful. But I think, as I said, about half the medicines wouldn't be here without it. And there's been a massive increase, I think, from 8 medicines before the regulation to over 240 now. So I hope they don't change it too much, because I think it seems to be effective. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this. No. No. It's an interesting topic. It's an interesting one to keep an eye on, because it looks like there's going to be a big shake-up of the legislation. But yeah, so I think we can leave up there, wrap up now. And thank you all very much for your attendance and for your questions and for your responding to the poll questions. It's been much appreciated. And if you have any other questions, just feel free to reach out. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.